It's the moment you've all been waiting for. We're going to learn about animals. I feel like everybody takes a biology class to learn about animals, myself included. And then you kind of get tricked into learning about everything else. And hopefully you're enjoying learning everything else. But we're going to work through classification of animals. So there are a lot of different phyla and classes of animals that are included in the kingdom Animalia. So we have domain Eukarya, kingdom Animalia, and then the various phylums, and in the phylums, various classes. So there is a table built out in Canvas for you. I do suggest using that as a way of taking notes because we are going to go through these objectives, which is just classifying various animals based on their defining characteristics. If you were to go out into the field as a scientist, right, and even as your own backyard with your kids, right? And your kids point at something and ask you, Mama, what is this? Or Daddy, what is this? Or your friends ask you, what is this organism? Okay, you should be able to look at something and say what it is based on characteristics. So this is a piece of coral, okay, and it has some defining characteristics that make it a coral. It is branched. It has these, it's a hard coral, and so it has a skeletal system, and it has these little divots in it that would have held the polyps of the corals. This one is considered, I mean, it's dead because there's nothing in here that's alive, but that's how we are going to use those things to classify them. So in order to get into this, we have to first ask ourselves, what is an animal? Well, you might intrinsically know this. It's like asking yourself, what is a plant or what is a fungi? There are classification requirements for something to be considered an animal. So what are the requirements? Well, animals are multicellular eukaryotes. They are all chemoheterotrophs, which means that they consume other things, whether those other things be plants or bacteria or other animals. All animals do internal digestion. So here's the variation difference between what we see with fungi and what we see with animals. Fungi do external digestion called absorption, and they release enzymes and absorb it through the mycelia, whereas animals have internal digestion and are going to eat food into their bodies in some way, shape, or form, and they're going to digest that food internally. Okay, all animals go through sexual reproduction at one point, even though a lot of them do rely on asexual reproduction. All animals are mobile at one point in their life, and they have specialized muscle and nerve tissues that allow them to have that sense of mobility. So I have a picture from a variety of different groups of animals here. So things like corals, even though you might not think about a coral, like I said, corals are an animal, okay? We also have things like sponges included in this because sponges are an animal. They fulfill most of these characteristics. Now, sponges are a little weird because they don't have specialized nerves or muscles, but they are animals because they have the rest of the characteristics. They're what we would call an early animal group. Insects, snakes, platypi, and other mammals. You've got your sea slugs, your sea stars. All of these are going to be classified as animals, even though they are incredibly diverse and unique because they share these characteristics in common. Okay, so let's look at the animal evolutionary tree. This is one of those phylogenetic trees or cladograms. And what we're going to see here is that there are several divisions of our animal tree lineage. As I said, sponges are very early. They're kind of a weird out group. They're unique. And then we have a group called cnidarians. This includes your jellies and your corals. And then we have a division between cnidarians and the rest of the animal kingdom, which are called bilateral animals. We'll talk about that in a second here. Within our bilateral animals, we have basically invertebrates and then vertebrates, but we classify them as protostomes and deuterostomes. And I'll talk about that in a minute. So we are going to go through all of these different lineages of animals, except for nematodes. I don't talk about them, unfortunately. I'll briefly talk about them, but we're going to go through these different lineages and we're going to learn what scientists look for to characterize these organisms as these various phyla. And then we'll learn about some of the classes of arthropods or the classes of mollusks so that we have a better understanding of the differentiation between that phyla itself. So let's talk about some of the things we need to know, again, before we can go through these divisions of animals, okay? First, we have to understand animal symmetry. One of the very first divisions of our animal kingdom is based on the symmetry. Do animals have radial symmetry or bilateral symmetry? So when we come back here to our evolutionary tree, the very first, sponges being ignored, okay, the very first division is between radial animals and bilateral animals. So radial animals can be sliced in any direction in a circle. They're like a pie or a pizza that's in a circle. You can cut it in any sort of angle and get equal halves regardless of where you cut that. That is what we see in our early animals of those cnidarians, okay? With bilateral symmetry, animals have left and right halves. That's what we see in humans, right? You have a left eye and a right eye, a left hand and a right hand. In animals with bilateral symmetry, we often see associated with that a characteristic called cephalization. Cephalization is a concentration of sensory organs and nerves in the head of an animal. So when we go back to our class here, flatworms, mollusks, annelids, nematodes, arthropods, and chordates all have bilateral symmetry as adults and therefore have a head with a concentration of sensory organs there. Echinoderms are a little weird, and we'll talk about them when we talk about deuterostomes. These are your sea stars, and they are actually bilaterally symmetrical as juveniles, which was why they are classified as a bilateral animal, because that is the ancestral state. So if we talk about our symmetry, that's our first big division. Another one of our big divisions is protostomes versus deuterostomes. So protostomes include your early classification here of your bilaterians. It's a really hard word to say, bilateral animals. And that includes your flatworms, mollusks, annelids, nematodes, and arthropods. Protostoan means mouth develops first. So when we talk about the early development of that zygote, right, the zygote is that fertilized egg, and it starts going through mitosis and growing into an embryo. Early on in that, one of the first openings of these groups of organisms becomes the mouth, and the second opening becomes the anus. In deuterostomes, that's switched, and so that includes your echinoderms and your chordates, and the first opening in the development of deuterostomes becomes the anus, and the second opening becomes the mouth. And so when we see this blastopore development, we see actually two distinct lineages of bilateral animals. So they have a common ancestor in bilateral symmetry, but we see a differentiation here, and it's two separate lineages of animals. Okay, so those are our major divisions on our tree here. We have the protostomes and deuterostomes, bilateral and radial, and then our early animals and our sponges. So now that we have a basis of animals and the evolutionary tree, the traits we're looking at, let's get into each individual group and see what it takes to classify an organism as one of these certain phyla. Okay, our first group is the early animals, and this does include both sponges and cnidarians. So sponges are what we would consider an outgroup. They are an animal because they do have internal digestion, they do have a motile stage, they do have tissues, they do have sexual reproduction, but then they're a little bit odd, okay? They are multicellular, but they don't have any true tissues. Their cells work together in a matrix, and so it's kind of a precursor to the tissues that we see in our other animal groups. They are aquatic, mostly in marine environments, and they do feed by filter feeding. So what's really cool about sponges is they actually have pores. So in this picture here, we have a yellow tube sponge, and we can see the pores on the inside of that sponge. Sponges pull water in from the base and up through the central cavity, called a canocyte, or a central cavity. Sorry, canocyte is the cells. And then we're going to see these cells in here called canocytes, the collar cells, that are these flagella that have this huge ability to move water. And as the water is moving over them, they are trapping little food particles, little bacteria, little algae, and they are then putting that into that cellular matrix, and they are consuming it in amoeboid cells. So sponges are a little bit funky. I think they're really cool. They're actually asymmetrical in their growth. Even though they may seem to be symmetrical, they are actually asymmetrical, and they do both asexual and sexual reproduction. So they can kind of grow almost like a plant where they grow out from that main body, but they will produce gametes and they will release gametes, sperm, and eggs. And then as a juvenile state, so that zygote, that fertilized egg, when it starts going through its development, it will have a mobile stage where it can actually move around to find an appropriate location. Once it finds an appropriate location, they do become sessile adults, and so they don't move around anymore once they're adults. Really cool group, but very early. We absolutely still use sea sponges as a cleaning tool, as a painting tool. If you go to like a paint store and you get a sponge, a natural sponge would be one of these animals, which is kind of wild that we use an animal to like sponge paint, but we do. Okay. Our other early group of animals are going to be your cnidarians. I know there's a C and it's probably throwing you off, but the C is silent. Okay. It's knee like your knee, like KN. It's like the same thing. Okay. So cnidarians are stinging animals. And this is another group of aquatic organisms. Okay. That are unique in that they are all radially symmetrical. So they have that ability to be divided in a variety of ways. Each individual polyp, so while this coral as a whole is not radially symmetrical, each individual polyp that I can't get my camera to like focus on, these little circles there it goes. Each one of those is a polyp, and those polyps are radially symmetrical. So when we look at something like a cup coral, that was the base is what we're seeing on this hard coral skeleton. Okay, they are all predators, which is just fascinating. All of these organisms have stinging cells. So you'll hear about people getting stung by a jellyfish or stung by a coral. You'll hear about the anemone if you ever watched Finding Nemo, right? If you don't want to get stung, you have to brush against the anemone. All of that is because these individual organisms, this line of animals, has these stinging cells called cnidocytes. And they do actually work like little harpoons, and they will sting and reel in prey. Once that prey is captured, all of those stinging cells are in tentacles surrounding the mouth. So that mouth is going to be also the anus. It has one opening, and it will push the food to the mouth, and then the mouth pulls it inside. They have a gastrovascular cavity, which is really well illustrated by this hydra here. It's just an open space inside that is going to be where digestion and then excretion occurs. And they can reproduce in a whole bunch of different ways. They absolutely do produce gametes. They will produce sperm and eggs, but we can have buds, which are genetically identical clones that are produced and are part of the whole until they like pop off and go be an adult by themselves. Corals, if you've ever seen a saltwater tank and they've had corals that are happy and healthy, they will take over the tank. They will be everywhere. They just divide themselves in half. They'll go through something called, it's similar to bacteria doing binary fission, where the anemones, especially, like, it's really disturbing if you see it. They kind of do it looks like a very large cleavage furrow of what we would see in mitosis, and the individual organism itself will split into two. Really weird group. There are two body forms for this group too, so another really distinct characteristic. You can have the polyp where the mouth is facing up, or the medusa where the mouth is facing down, which is why your jellies are included in this. So you have your jellies, your hydras, your anemones, your corals, your Portuguese manowar. All of those animals are considered cnidarians. There are some freshwater, like hydras are freshwater. There's a freshwater jellyfish species that's like found in one place, one lake that's locked away from the world. It's fascinating. But other than that, like, these guys are pretty much everywhere in the oceans, and they are very closely associated to reefs because corals make up the coral reefs. So we absolutely do rely on these animals as an ecosystem in their own right. Okay? And that's an animal. Isn't that crazy? Corals and sponges are animals. So with that, make sure that you can check your understanding. These are going to be the major things with animals, as well as then your sponges and cnidarians, and why understanding them is important because they are early evolutionary history. And then we're going to get into like the animals that you might be more familiar with, question mark. Some of them are common, some of them are not. All right, we are going to talk about the protostomes in the rest of today's lecture, and then we'll talk about the deuterostomes in chapter 19, part 2. So here is our first protostome. Remember, protostomes means that the mouth develops first, and our first group of animals are called your platyhelminths, okay, or platyhelminths. These are your flatworms. Flatworms include a lot of different kinds of critters. The ones that we have here in North Carolina are going to be planaria. I love planaria. I think planaria are some of the coolest little critters. The brown planaria are native, regularly found in ponds and streams. They're really important decomposers and they eat like meat and other things. And then we also have terrestrial ones. This is our first group that we see like living on land. Sponges don't live on land, corals and things don't live on land, but your flatworms can. There are absolutely marine, freshwater, aquatic ones, but there are also terrestrial ones. If you ever see these ones here in this top corner, these like striped guys with this shovel head, these are called hammerhead worms. They are not native to North Carolina. They're invasive from Asia. If you do find them, don't cut them in half. If you cut them in half, you've just made two. This particular group of animals is very capable of regenerating from being cut into pieces. In fact, we keep brown planaria in the lab here as a specimen for Bio 112 labs, and in order to keep our population up, I don't buy new planaria. I just cut the large ones in half, and within a week or 2 weeks, they will have grown back to their full size from the missing part, which is so cool. You can also make two-headed planaria. Wild, in my opinion, because they'll grow back their missing half. It's insane. So if you do find these invasive species in North Carolina, the best thing to do is put them in vinegar. If you put them in vinegar, it's an acid. It will dissolve them. They don't feel pain, okay, the same way that you would think, but they are problematic. They do eat our native snails, our native earthworms. They'll get after ants. They are an invasive predator. So if you do find them, they're very common. I found them in my backyard more than once. You can just put them in vinegar to get rid of them, and you're doing a good thing for your environment. Okay, this group is able to do that replication process where they can divide and be cut in half and grow back because they don't have a true digestive system. They do have cephalization, but it is very, very, very basic. We do see eye spots and auricles that are sensing light and movement and like smells, but they're not sensing things in the same way that you and I are. They are very simple when we look at their physical construction, and that means that they can then grow back through that regeneration. They do cross-fertilize. A lot of these are hermaphrodites, and they will sexually reproduce. There are actually some really beautiful marine flatworms, and there's an episode of Planet Earth style show called The Mating Game, and they do talk about the penis jousting in ribbon worms, which are a flatworm. So if you're curious about it, go look it up. They're beautiful. They're blue. They're bright. They're vivid, but they are really cool to watch doing their thing. Okay, so that's our first group here. These are very simple bilateral animals. Very, like, again, very, very simple group. Okay, in fact, they're the ones that really give rise to that old wives' tale that earthworms will grow back if you cut them in half. They won't, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes here. Okay, then we have our mollusks. So phylum Mollusca means soft-bodied. This particular group of animals are characterized specifically by having a visceral mass, a muscular foot, and a mantle. The mantle may or may not secrete a shell, so slugs are part of this. They lost their shell, but ancestrally they had one, and so they still have a mantle. That's why slugs are kind of slimy and goopy, the same thing as snails. I love snails and slugs. I feel like they're some of my favorite critters in this entire world. And it's funny because as I'm getting older, I'm realizing more and more the like weird things that I love. Slugs and snails, way up there. I could watch aquatic snails cleaning a fish tank probably for hours and not get bored. I love them. So this group is really cool. They are terrestrial and aquatic. They are freshwater and marine. They do both sexual and they do sexual reproduction. They can regenerate body parts that are lost, but they can't grow back completely. Because imagine if you broke a snail in half, you've now broken its heart, you've exposed its blood system, you've broken its intestinal tract, and it cannot like recover from that. They do have separate sexes as well, which is really interesting. Some of them are hermaphroditic. You will find hermaphroditic snails and slugs, but we do see a lot of separate sexes in these guys as well. The cool thing about this group is there are 3 classes, and there is a class of mollusks that you would not expect to be a mollusk. Okay, are you ready for it? I don't know that you are. Ready? The 3 classes of mollusks include your gastropods, which are your snails and slugs, your cephalopods, which are your octopi and squids, and your bivalves, which are your clams, oysters, scallops, and mussels. And if when I was learning this, if someone had told me that octopi were related to scallops, I would have never believed them. But when we look at the physical characteristics, right? The visceral mass that has the internal organs, the muscular foot for locomotion, and the mantle, cephalopods have those 3 traits. Okay, and since those are the 3 traits we use to classify this group of animals, we say if it has these characteristics, it is a mollusk. Cephalopods are mollusks. Okay, and it makes sense when we look at the ancestral lineage of cephalopods. That includes things like your nautilus, which does have a shell. Nautilus has a shell that's very similar to what we see in our snails, in our gastropods. And so if you think about it, you go, oh, well, it had a mantle that's secreting the shell. The shell is made of the same characteristics. It's a homologous trait, right? We talked about that with evolution. They have a muscular foot, but the muscular foot in your cephalopods has evolved into those tentacles or those arms. And then we see a lot of other variations. So let's talk about gastropods. You can find gastropods if you go outside like right now and move around the leaf litter. You're going to find snails and slugs here in North Carolina. We have a fantastic environment for them. Gastropods can be herbivores or carnivores. They can be detritivores. They can eat just about anything. And they actually do gas exchange through something called their mantle. Okay, they can do gas exchange through their mantle. Terrestrial snails will have an opening that will allow them to breathe without drying out. Because again, living on land means being able to avoid drying out. This includes your nudibranchs, which are some of the most beautiful organisms, super colorful, absolutely fascinating. Again, big fan of gastropods. I don't know what it is. It means stomach foot, so maybe that's what it is because they crawl on their stomach, which is their foot. I don't know. Okay. Cephalopods have a well-developed nervous system. You've probably heard how octopi are incredibly intelligent. They absolutely are. They're incredibly intelligent. They have really complex sensory organs. They have a really well-developed nervous system. Some of my favorite stories about cephalopods are from aquarium workers who have had fun encounters with their cephalopods because they're so intelligent. One of my personal favorite stories is that cephalopods, so someone had a giant Pacific octopus in a tank at an aquarium, and across the open space there was a hospital tank for fish that were quarantined because they were new to the aquarium or they were ill and they were getting treatment. And in the mornings, aquarium staff would come in and they would look at their animals. One of the things as a zookeeper is you count your animals. So as an aquarium staff, you go in and you count your fish. And so they'd go to the hospital tank and they would be missing fish. And they could not figure out where these fish had gone. They were just gone. There was no sign, no evidence of the fish. There wasn't a carcass in the tank. They were just gone. So they set up cameras. And what they found was that the giant Pacific octopus was letting itself out of its enclosure at night, walking across the environment, across the open space, letting itself into the hospital tank and having a midnight snack. It would then put itself back in its original tank, and they never knew because the ground would dry by morning. I love it. The only conspiracy theory, your low stakes conspiracy theory that I love is that octopi are alien. It's fascinating. It's hilarious. But the pressure for natural selection was to be the top predator in that ecosystem. And so we did see those traits evolve in that octopi from that classification. Okay. Our last group are the bivalves, our last class of mollusks. These are the ones that have two parts to their shells, and this includes your scallops and your mussels and a lot of the things that we're familiar with here. They are also included as a mollusk because they have those three main characteristics. I'm not going to test you on my story time, but I do like to tell it because for me, stories help me understand these guys, okay? Whoops, after mollusks, we have our annelids. Annelid means little ring. Annelida means little ring. And this is your earthworms. This is our first terrestrial group of organisms that gets really complex. So that's not fair. Okay, snails are pretty complex. But if I were to look at a snail and dissect a snail as compared to an earthworm, I think earthworms are really, really interesting. So when we look at an earthworm on the inside, and this includes leeches and Christmas worms and other worms as well, you'll hear sometimes the old wives' tale that if you cut an earthworm in half, it'll grow back. Unfortunately, that is not true. Earthworms have a closed circulatory system, an extensive nervous system, a closed digestive tract, and they are completely what's called the coelom, where they have everything as a tube within a tube that is contained within tissues. We have very unique muscle groups here, very well-defined muscle groups here. And so, honestly, if you cut an earthworm, you've killed the earthworm. I'm sorry. Okay. Now, mind you, there are a lot of earthworms, and they do absolutely have really important roles to play in the ecosystem. So don't feel bad if you use them for fishing. You probably know that if you cut a worm in half, it will die because you've basically cut its circulatory system, and it's going to bleed out, just like you if you cut a circulatory system. So what's really cool about earthworms is they have a very, very concentrated sense of cephalization. And when we look in them, all of their really important organs, their hearts, their crop, their gizzard, their intestinal tract, their mouth, their pharynx, which helps them grind their food, is all above what's called the clitellum. The clitellum is going to be the reproductive structure. It means a little saddle. And if you look at an earthworm, it actually doesn't go all the way around the worm. It's just on the first top half. That clitellum is how these worms will exchange seminal fluid. So they are hermaphroditic, your earthworms are. And then that clitellum will be where the eggs develop, and it will be shed as an egg case to protect the offspring from drying out. These guys have a hydrostatic skeleton, which means that they don't have bones, but if you've ever picked up a live earthworm, they are very kind of tense, and that's because they have musculature and they have a lot of water internally, and that water pushes against that musculature to allow them to move effectively. Okay, they do gas exchange through their skin, which is really interesting because that explains why worms come to the surface during a rainstorm. When it rains, the soil gets too wet, the earthworms will drown. When it's dry, the earthworms dry out. They can't do gas exchange and they die. So if you ever see a worm on the sidewalk, just chuck it back into the grass so it can get into the dirt. It does really good things for our ecosystem. It's a really big detritivore. It breaks down a lot of dead and decomposing material. It leaves really good fertilizer in the soil, and it's really important part of the food chain. So love your worms, okay? If you want to look into a nightmare worm that is, of course, in Australia, you should Google the Smithsonian video the Smithsonian Museum, the Smithsonian video of the bobbit worm. Past classes in my seated classes, I've shown that video to have been obsessed. It's fantastic. So the bobbit worm is a kind of worm that is a large predator worm, and it can get to be 9 feet long, and it is predatory. So we do have a variation there. We also have things like your Christmas tree worms. These are sensory projections that are going to be used to sense their environment and do some gas exchange there. And then we also include things like leeches. Leeches are absolutely fascinating, and you can see that leeches have the rings, the Christmas tree worms have rings, your earthworms have rings, and so this is why these are very different from your flatworms. Flatworms are not true worms. Medicinal leeches are actually really useful, especially in things like skin grafts. We're not saying that you have too much blood or bad humors. We're saying that if you have a majorly bad burn and you need to have a skin graft or any sort of other extensive damage, adding leeches to that environment is going to increase and encourage blood flow, and it leeches have a anticoagulant in their saliva that stops clotting, so it can actually encourage tissue grafts to be successful. So medicinal leeches, fantastic. I had a student many years ago now who, when he had damage from an IED and had to have a skin graft, they used medicinal leeches, and he said it was really fascinating, but it actually made the skin graft really successful for him. So, leeches are kind of gross. I get it, but they actually can serve a very important purpose. Okay? And then our last group includes arthropods. If you are spider scared or arachnophobia, please make sure that you are noting that these are pictures, okay? But we're going to look at some spiders, okay? So arthropods means jointed foot. This includes your spiders, your millipedes, your centipedes, your crustaceans, and your insects. There are some major characteristics of this group that allow them to be so successful. They are incredibly diverse. They are the dominant group of invertebrates on this planet are your arthropods. They vastly outnumber everybody else. And these are because of their jointed foot. So all of these guys have joints to their feet. That jointed appendage can then be modified to whatever these animals have needed. So wings are not included. Wings are different, right, in insects. But the feet, your claws and your crabs, your little little feet in your spiders. This is a jumping spider, and he is the cutest thing. They're little friends. They don't do anything bad, okay? All of your arthropods have an exoskeleton. So they have this external skeleton that provides them the physical support to handle gravity in a terrestrial environment. And their exoskeleton is made of chitin. It is not the same as chitin in fungi. It is chitin of these insects, okay? So we've heard chitin more than once now. What's also really cool about arthropods is they have segmentation. So we do see segmentation in the annelids, in these ring segmentation, but it's still all kind of like one long organism. Here we get segmentation where each part of the body has a very specific job to do. The more specialized that you become, the more complex you become. That does allow you to generally live in and utilize different resources from everybody else, okay? Insects have a really well-developed nervous system. It's why it's really hard to capture them, because their nervous system is very, very fast and very responsive. And they have a variety of respiratory organs that allow them to breathe on land, breathe air, or in the case of some of these guys, breathe in the water without drying out. So breathing on land, remember, being on land is very, very dry. With our plants, they had developed embryos that could live on land. All of these terrestrial organisms have approached land in different ways, but all of them have to avoid drying out. This is our first group that we see living in truly dry environments. We see arthropods living in deserts. We see them living basically everywhere except for Antarctica. This group does not rely solely on water, whereas like our earthworms rely on water for gas exchange. Your cephalopods rely on water, right? Even your mollusks in the forms of your like slugs and snails are very, very prone to drying out when they cannot be in a damp enough environment. Arthropods are able to live completely outside of the water in very dry environments and be just fine. And the last thing that allows arthropods to be really, really good at living in all these environments is this metamorphosis. Generally speaking, the larval or juvenile stages and the adults may have very different lifestyles, which reduces competition between individuals of the same species. And if we reduce competition, we can increase fitness. And so that's one of the big things that is characterizing this group of organisms. So let's talk about the body plan of arthropods. So when we talk about segmentation, here's where it comes into play. When we see arthropods, okay, unlike our earthworms, which like there's a head and an abdomen, but it's still all one long tube. Here we end up seeing a head and thorax. So you can have a cephalothorax, like in our spiders, we have a fused cephalothorax, and the same thing in our crustaceans, where you have the head and thorax are all kind of one. Okay, and then you have an abdomen that's separate. So if you think about your spiders, right, the abdomen is going to be the butt part of the spider, and then the thorax and head, the cephalothorax, is going to be where those limbs come off of. In our myriapods, you have a head and then a trunk. And then your insect, you have a true triple segmentation in the head, thorax, and abdomen. But these segments are all then very specialized and are going to have particular tissue systems and organ systems that are doing very, very unique jobs. Okay. All of their legs are jointed for mobility, which allows these guys to move very quickly and very effectively in their environment. They have that chitinous exoskeleton and they have an open vascular system. So they can't get incredibly large because one, gravity, okay, two, drying out and getting gas exchange can be difficult, and three, they have a open vasculatory system. So they don't have closed blood vessels like we do, where our blood system is all like you have veins and arteries that all connect to the heart. Theirs is just kind of a big open area of goop, and they have a heart that's pumping, but it's like a machine, a washing machine agitator, in that it's just moving that fluid around the body. Okay. That's why when you squish an insect, it's just kind of goop inside. It's because they have that open vascular system. So we're going to talk about each of the classes, and then that's it for today. So the class arachnids includes your spiders, your scorpions, your daddy long legs, which are their own thing. They're not spiders, your ticks, and your mites. A really interesting group. One of the first groups believed to move on to land, including your scorpions, who are very well adapted to dry desert environments. So when we talk about living outside of water, that's what we mean here. They don't need to lay their eggs in water. Their eggs are desiccation proof. They are very, very well adapted. These are all terrestrial. Okay, there are some spiders that are like fishing spiders that do live near water and will catch fish, but they are still terrestrial organisms. They breathe through things called book lungs. So at the base of this black widow's abdomen here, so here's the fused cephalothorax, here's the abdomen with the spinneret, there is an opening. That opening is going to be how she breathes. So she is going to be breathing by pumping that abdomen. They don't breathe through their mouths. They actually breathe through there, and they have these layered little gill-like structures called book lungs. Same thing with your scorpions, and having that small opening prevents drying out. Okay. All of our arachnids have 8 legs. That's our main classification here with that fused cephalothorax. Most of them produce some sort of venom as a way of immobilizing prey because they are predatory. And they are going to be a very important group of organisms in maintaining balance to ecosystems, but they're also a group of organisms of human interest, not because we're scared of spiders or black widow spiders could bite you and hurt you, but because of things like ticks. Ticks spread a lot of disease, including Lyme disease and Rocky Mountain spotted fever, and there's a lot of things. They are a vector of human illness. And so if you ever get a tick, this is my PSA on ticks, do not pinch or burn or try to pull that tick. What you really should do is coat it in something like coconut oil, because if you block that breathing hole, that area where the book lungs are, the tick will release without regurgitating. If you startle the tick and it regurgitates the blood meal back into your bloodstream, you are washing bacteria into your body. The best thing to do is to allow the tick to release naturally by basically stopping it from being able to breathe. And as we've learned, right, no air, no gas exchange, no oxygen, no cellular respiration. Their bodies are going to respond to homeostasis the same way yours does, and they are going to try to desperately find a way to breathe, which they cannot do if they are attached to a host. They need to go and get cleaned off. They don't breathe through their mouths. That's how their heads can be buried in your skin, and you don't want to leave any of those mouth parts behind or have that tick backwash into you. So PSA on ticks here, okay? We also have our myriapods. These are your centipedes and millipedes. Centipedes are identified by 1 pair of leg segments per body, and millipedes have 2. Millipedes are detritivores and herbivores. They're pretty calm and chill. Centipedes are predators. They are carnivorous, and they have the little pincers there with venom to help with that. These guys are terrestrial. They're often found in dead and decomposing wood, even centipedes, because they do prefer to hunt like pill bugs, earthworms, snails, that sort of thing. They breathe through their spiracles. So they have these little openings on the side of their body, which is kind of hard to see in this picture here. There's one right there. There's this black stripe on this body segment, and there's like a little divot looking section there. That would be an opening where they would be able to then do gas exchange. Again, they don't breathe through their mouths. Just a really cool group. Myria means many, so these are your many-footed critters. Okay. Crustaceans, we're all pretty familiar with too, I think, because we live close to the ocean, but these do include mostly aquatic organisms. The only truly terrestrial crustacean is your pillbug or your isopods. Pillbug, sowbug, potato bug, roly-poly, whatever you call them, those are crustaceans. They are not insects. Crustaceans have a lot more legs than insects, and they have a fused cephalothorax. They often have gills above their walking legs, and so if you were to take like a lobster and peel the backing off of the lobster head, that part that's the cephalothorax, you will see the gills underneath there. Crabs have gills above their legs. We have things like Daphnia, which are going to be doing their small little crustaceans. They do gas exchange through diffusion. And this also includes barnacles. Barnacles look like mollusks, but they are not mollusks. They do not have those key traits. They have the traits shared with crustaceans, so they're classified as a crustacean. And what we actually see out here are their legs, and they use their legs to filter feed. Really kind of a cool group. If you're ever curious, like they have a very hard exoskeleton that is still made of chitin. So it is similar to, it is a polysaccharide. Remember, chitin is a polysaccharide. And then our last group would be our hexapods. Hexapods means six-footed, and so all insects have 6 feet. Because of this, we are going to be able to classify something as a arthropod, as a hexapod, as an insect is a classification of hexapods. They all have sexual reproduction and they have separate sexes. And their sexual reproduction is done internally because they lay eggs in a case to prevent drying out. Other groups may have external fertilization. Hexapods have internal fertilization. Another key trait of insects is that 3-segment body, as well as having wings. Wings is actually an ancestral trait of insects. Some insects have lost the ability to fly. This includes things like fleas and lice, but even ants, the queen ant will fly, the queen termite will fly, and they will take a mating flight. So even if they don't fly for their entire lives, they do have the ability to fly at some part in their life. They are incredibly numerous and diverse, and their offspring often do live in different environments. So think about like a caterpillar is going to be living and chewing on leaves and things, but a butterfly is going to be eating the nectar from the flower. We're eating 2 different things. We do not compete with our offspring. That is going to increase the ability of success. This group is incredibly successful and is actually the dominant form of arthropods on this planet today. There are many, many, many more insects and hexapods than we see of other classifications, at least that we know of. Okay. Really cool group of organisms, absolutely fascinating. Now, I am not an insect person in the idea that I don't want to touch them, but I love watching them, because if you go watch like a carpenter bee or a bumblebee eating a flower, you're going to watch that abdomen pumping. That is how that animal is breathing. It's going to be visiting the flowers. It gets covered in pollen. They're cute and fuzzy. Now, I'm not saying I like all of them. I hate fleas. My cats had fleas one year, and it was the worst time of my life. I don't like houseflies. I don't like mosquitoes. But I think we can all appreciate how important these are. When we lose insects, we actually lose entire ecosystems. So it's a really important group of animals. Here's your check your understanding. That's the end of today's lecture. I know it's a little bit longer, but we had some animals to get through. Make sure you can classify all of these groups. If I ask you, if I say this animal has a visceral mass, a mantle, and a muscular foot, you need to be able to tell me it's a mollusk. If I say this animal has 3 body segments, 6 legs, and flies, you should be able to tell me that's a hexapod. That's a class hexapod of the arthropod phylum. Practice going through and identifying these. A lot of these you guys already know. We learn about animals at various points in our life. We're going to just be adding some of those very key scientific terms, the things that we look to classify these animals. We will finish chapter 19 with talking about echinoderms and chordates, our two groups of deuterostomes. And let me know if you have any questions. Have a great day.